I just want to say thank you very much to everyone for attending this John Ruskin A Legacy sort of mini evening via Zoom. I want to just start by saying this is Will's Month, and I think we all know the importance of donating and leaving legacies to Sheffield Museum, who are very much at the heart of Sheffield. And if we didn't obviously leave legacies to them, they wouldn't be able to offer the cultural experience that they do to people of all ages. Yeah, I'm delighted to say that we're continuing the 4th year of our legacy partnership with Sheffield Museums. And again, just to reiterate that, it's a pleasure to be working with them, highlighting the importance of donating and making legacies to Sheffield Museums. And there's a nice synergy with them being sort of local heart of Sheffield and Wakesmith being a local firm as well. So I think that's probably enough from me, but I'll hand you now over to Ash, who will do the important John Ruskin Legacy talk.
Hi everyone, good evening. Hope you can all hear me. So I'm the Ruskin Curator. I've been in post a couple of months. It's really great to give my first talk about Ruskin and about what we do at Sheffield Museums. So when Mel asked me to talk about Ruskin's legacy for this talk, it seemed actually like a perfect fit and really perfect timing, as we're actually currently redisplaying and rethinking how we present Ruskin's collection and his legacy to our audiences. So although installation periods are kind of some of the busiest periods we have as curators, being in the depths of the installation of the Ruskin Gallery has actually been a bonus, as Ruskin and his legacy were kind of really fresh in my mind, and it's all I've been thinking about, how to talk about this legacy for the past kind of 4 months. Therefore, I've been kind of totally engrossed in Ruskin land. And being October and being Will's Month, opening a new display which works with a collection which was always intended to be a legacy is actually really perfect. My text is down here, so that's why I'm looking down here. I think the one issue for this talk is really kind of the enormity of Ruskin's gift, so how big his legacy is. There's a lifetime's work in fully understanding John Ruskin, and the Ruskin Collection, and indeed many, have devoted their lives to understanding the breadth and the scope of Ruskin's work and his legacy. So today, I'm going to provide just a brief overview and introduction to the man, some of his interests, and how the gifting of his collection to Sheffield has created a legacy which is important and relevant today. Then I'll go on to talk about the exciting work we're doing in the gallery to redisplay and represent the collection. Ruskin was born on the 8th of February 1819 in Brunswick Square in London. The son of a wine and sherry importer, he had a sheltered but financially privileged upbringing. His father wanted Ruskin to lead the life of a gentleman. As was common for the upper classes at the time, Ruskin's father took the family on long tours of England and Europe and encouraged the young Ruskin's interest in art and literature. His mother was an evangelical Christian who taught Ruskin to memorize large sections of the Bible and hoped he would become Archbishop of Canterbury. So they both had high hopes for their young son. Both parents influenced Ruskin hugely, and their Christian ideas and also their gentlemanly ideas can be seen in much of Ruskin's work. At just 14, Ruskin published his first paper on geology, and by 17 had published a series of articles on the poetry of architecture. Ruskin went on to the University of Oxford and was awarded the Newdigate Prize for Poetry, which was presented to him by Wordsworth at just 20 years old. So he was a real kind of polymath. Ruskin was interested in a broad range of topics from a young age and would come to be known as a true Victorian polymath, studying and writing on nature and architecture, craftsmanship, geology, botany, Greek myth, education, the role of work, and a dizzying array of other subjects. In 1837, Ruskin became a fellow of the Royal Geological Society, and he meets J.M.W. Turner, an artist who would become a key artist in the Ruskin collection, as well as an inspiration for much of Ruskin's writing, and obviously today, incredibly famous, important British artist. The image on screen shows Turner's view of Sheffield from Derbyshire Lane, close to Mearsbrook Park, which is one of the most popular highlights of the Ruskin collection. In 1843, Ruskin published the first volume of Modern Painters, in which he argues for artists to study nature closely and show it as it really is, not to create idealized versions. Modern Painters is filled with joyous and thorough observations of nature, with sections devoted to clouds, mountains, rocks, trees, and plants. The work has come to be seen as a defense of the later work of J.M.W. Turner, who was much underappreciated at the time. Its main argument is that art should devote itself to the accurate documentation of nature, as opposed to the idealized and edited versions of nature created by the old masters and the picturesque trend or the German sublime, which were popular at the time, both of which edited and magnified nature to become more beautiful and awe-inspiring, but in turn sidelined the reality of the locations they were depicting. Criticism of the popular status quo, such as in modern painters, careful looking and observing of nature, and going against the majority line of thinking, would become tropes throughout Ruskin's career. In 1854, Ruskin taught drawing and spoke on the role of work at the Working Men's College in Camden, which is today Europe's oldest surviving centre for adult education, maybe a foreshadowing of his focus on improving the life of the working classes that would play out throughout his long career. Over the next few years, Ruskin continues to study broadly and write on art and architecture, amongst other topics. He becomes a respected art critic and a critic more broadly of the Victorian period. Throughout, Ruskin continues to travel. He produces drawings from life, and for Ruskin, drawing becomes a way of both recording the world around him, but also a way of understanding and investigating the world as it is, not as it is idealized. Through this close looking at nature and architecture, Ruskin becomes interested in the conservation and protection of both the natural and the built environment. In 1870, Ruskin establishes the Ruskin Drawing School at the University of Oxford and publishes his first series of Oxford lectures. His influence on the University of Oxford provides a large part of his legacy today, with the Ruskin Drawing School, now the Ruskin School of Art, continuing to educate some of the UK's most successful artists, such as R.B. Catai, and more recently Conrad Shawcross. The annual Ruskin lectures that take his name still take place to this day and are an important part of the art historical calendar. 1871 is a key date for us here in Sheffield. In 1871, Ruskin forms the St George's Company, which would go on to become the Guild of St George. St George is a symbol of good fighting evil. Ruskin saw this as a symbolic of the fight against the social evils of poverty, injustice, and exploitation in Victorian Britain. Ruskin set out his aims for the Guild in the public letters to the workmen and labourers of Great Britain, known as Fors Clavergia, which took the form of an ongoing series of letters produced as pamphlets and distributed widely. Fors were his most controversial and personal text to date. Ruskin told his readers, quote, "I neither wish to please nor displease you, but to provoke you to think," end quote. Discursive, angry, and uncompromising, Fors Clavergia is now seen as the most innovative and in many ways his most modern work. One of the key concepts of Fors Clavergia is to develop a vision of the moral value of sincere labour, or in easier words, he was fighting for useful and productive work. It's during this period that Ruskin cements his ideas, attacking capitalism and industrialization, and showing interest in traditional craftsmanship and community or cooperative forms of work and ownership. Within Fors Clavergia and other texts, he lays out key ideas. Sorry, I pressed the wrong button then. His key ideas were to turn wasteland into food-producing plots, to protect wildlife, to educate all people in schools according to their specific needs, and to open public libraries and galleries as a national cultural store for all people. Ruskin had identified 3 parts of English life in need of support and improvement in these aims. He wanted to improve art education, craft work, and the rural economy. These aims are the focus of the Guild of St George to this day. The Guild would be the organisation through which Ruskin was able to turn the focus of his writing into physical action, testing his ideas in the real world. Members of the Guild, known as companions, were expected to tithe a percentage of their wage to the Guild, so that it could be used to provide access to educational opportunities for those less fortunate. At this time, Ruskin grew his collection of scientific books, minerals, architectural drawings, and his collection started to take shape as we know it today. Through the Guild, Ruskin would act on his dream to create a national cultural store to educate all people, a kind of national library of art and culture that would be open and accessible to all, used to inspire craftsmen and working people. Although this concept seems pretty normal to us today, with almost every city having their own museum and library, at the time, just 19 years after the founding of the V&A Museum, Ruskin's ideas to create these spaces within the areas that the workers actually lived, in their own suburbs and their own backyards, was fresh and exciting. In 1875, Ruskin established the St George's Museum in Walkley in Sheffield, with his ex-student Henry Swan as the curator. Unusually, the museum was amongst the workers' homes, its location on the hill chosen so that it sat above the smoke and smog of the industrial city. The museum and its collection of watercolours, drawings, prints, plaster casts, minerals, and illustrated manuscripts was intended to be an educational resource and to stimulate the creative imaginations of Sheffield's metalworkers. The St George's Museum encouraged people to respect nature and to gain happiness and self-improvement from the experience. Ruskin hoped that the experience, the artwork, and the placing of the museum would encourage visitors to view the work and afterwards to take a country stroll. So, which button am I pressing? That one. Ruskin actually only visited Sheffield occasionally to visit his ex-student Henry Swan, but he was impressed by both the geographic and the social-political landscape. The skilled work of the metal industry chimed with his interest in handicrafts and meaningful work at a time when mass mechanization, which Ruskin saw as damaging to workers' well-being and their relationship to work, was taking over in other industrial cities. He was also excited by the city's closeness to nature, imagining visitors to the museum to be encouraged to take advantage of the landscape around them. Over the coming years, the collection would grow in size. Ruskin would continue to donate works to the Guild and to the museum from his private collection, as well as purchase works especially for the Guild to become part of the museum's collection. The museum was open from 9 a.m. till 9 p.m. Monday to Saturday, so that it was, quote, accessible to public curiosity. The museum was attracting 60,000 visitors a year by 1890, with famous visitors including writer Oscar Wilde and designer William Morris. And kind of William Morris's ideas about craft and life would very much follow on from Ruskinian concepts. There is evidence that the museum did fulfill Ruskin's aims, and metalworkers did visit and were inspired by the artworks on display. For example, Benjamin Creswick, a knife grinder from Walkley, visited the museum regularly enough for the curator, Henry Swan, to take interest in him and invite him to his house. Ruskin also invited Creswick to his home, and they went on to help sponsor him in training in sculpture. Creswick became a respected sculptor and exhibitor at the Royal Academy in London, and Creswick's sons, Charles and John, and his daughter-in-law, Nora, continued his legacy, creating sculptures, metalwork, and jewellery. Many works by the Creswicks are in the collection today. So the collection also brings in these other people who were associated with the collection, and so associated more broadly with the museum. In 1876, Ruskin purchases farmland in Totley in Sheffield, and he establishes St George's Farm as an experiment in communal work and cooperative farming. So again, showing these kind of really utopian ideas that were very forward-thinking for the time. In 1884, Ruskin gives lectures on the storm cloud of the 19th century, which for the first time recognizes climate change. In 1885, Ruskin suffers from an attack of mental illness, forcing him to step down from the Slade Professorship at the University of Oxford. So kind of interesting that this was made public at a time when it was not kind of spoken about as much. In 1890, the Walkley site became too small for the growing Ruskin collection, and Sheffield Council offered Mearsbrook Park House as a new home for the Ruskin Museum. The Ruskin Museum opens at Mearsbrook Hall in Sheffield in 1890 and becomes an instant success. Over the next 50 years, the collection's fortunes go through cycles, with Ruskin's popularity in the popular imagination waning after his death in 1900. Sadly, Sheffield's Ruskin collection is the only collection that ever came into being during Ruskin's lifetime, but its quality, scope, and importance illustrate not only Ruskin's ambition, but how all his ideas converged and were illustrated through the works of art he brought together for the collection. So Ruskin, as a kind of basis, he really wanted to set up these museums across the country and for every city to have one, and Sheffield was the test bed, but it was the only one that ever got built. Throughout the Mearsbrook Park period, the collection remains popular with local people and regular talks take place at the hall. So interestingly, late 19th century and early 20th century museums are often thought of as predominantly run by men. But this was not the case with the Ruskin Collection. So Mrs. Genevieve Pilley, taking the role of assistant at the Ruskin Museum from 1898 and was actually its keeper from 1931 until 1949. Letters and reports show us that her huge dedication to the collection and its staff, as its fortunes fluctuated during the earlier 20th century. Pilley had an extensive knowledge of the collection and Ruskin's original plans for it. She was also a skilled illustrator of manuscripts, and the collection's medieval manuscripts were particularly close to her heart. So today, we not only have these amazing medieval manuscripts in the collection, but we also have a lot of these copies and versions that Miss Pilley did. But sadly, in 1953, the Ruskin Museum at Meersbrook Park closes, and the collection is put into storage at the University of Reading. So for quite a long time, there's a gap where the collection's not easily accessible to the public at the University of Reading. And then in 1885, the collection is put on display again at the new Ruskin Gallery on Norfolk Street in Sheffield city centre. In 1997, the Ruskin Library opens at the University of Lancaster, which houses Ruskin's letters and archive. And in 2001, the Ruskin collection moves to the new Millennium Gallery on Arundel Gate in Sheffield. Sheffield's Ruskin Collection is the only public collection actually created by Ruskin, although there are many collections dedicated to his work around the world, including in Tokyo, Oxford, and at Yale University. And where am I? So, and also in 2001, the Guild of St. George sets up the campaign for drawing, also known as the Big Draw, which is launched that year. This goes on to become a charity in its own right and is today the world's largest drawing festival, reaching large audiences and continuing Ruskin's passion for drawing from life and the importance of drawing for understanding the world around us. So now I've given you a brief overview of the collection and the man who set it up. The next obvious question is, so what's in the collection and why is it important? The collection contains almost 17,000 items, which is actually pretty hard to count. So for instance, some are very rare books where each page has been cut out of its binding by its previous owner and backed onto museum grade materials, meaning that we count each page which is now removed from the book as a single object, whereas others are books in their entirety, which may house hundreds of rare drawings within one single volume. So the actual number of works of art in the collection is somewhat flexible and hard to gauge. The collection includes a large number of rare, first edition, and artistically and scientifically important books, as well as sections from these books. Because often I spoke about these books were purchased by subscription, and the binding of the books was left to the recipient of each installment. So in some cases, we have the same books as other museums, but they look completely and utterly different because the owner of them had them bound themselves, basically. If you see in this image here, this is from the Meersbrook Hall days, but the books on the back wall are still in, that is a major part of the collection, and they're still stored in these cabinets in our storage areas today. So when I work with them, I kind of get to go in these amazing Victorian cabinets and have a look at them. So among the books, we have The Birds of America by James Audubon. So here we see a beautiful snowy heron and an Icelandic falcon. This is considered one of the most important natural history books in the world. And these drawings are absolutely massive. So when we think of books, I think we think of kind of modern books, but some of these drawings are over 1.5 meters. So the books they came from are actually kind of absolutely enormous. And a lot of them were done from expeditions. He would have gone out to find the birds, but also sadly, a lot of them would have been shot and killed and mounted so that he could draw them more stylistically or more kind of accurately, because they were also scientific drawings. So the kind of beauty hides something slightly darker. We have copies of The Birds of Australia by John Gould. So this is a beautiful spangled kookaburra from that bird. Not being an ornithologist myself, sometimes I'm pretty shocked at the amount of birds in the collection. So recently we've just digitized a book of kingfishers, and there are over 100 types of kingfisher in this one book. And I think rather naively, maybe I always thought a kingfisher was a specific type of bird, but I didn't realize it was a subgenre. And there's kind of all these beautiful ones. There are also works in the collection where we're unsure of the background. We have to do a lot of investigative work, but there are kind of tantalizing clues, such as this image of a blue petrel by Forster. So the Natural History Museum holds another version of this work, and we know the work was carried out on Cook's second voyage to locate a southern landmass between 1772 and 1775. But there's some doubt whether this is an original watercolor by George Forster or a copy of a tracing by another artist. This could be a first sketch towards Forster's official drawings from that trip. However, it could equally be a later tracing after the fact. The support is just about thin enough to trace and has residue at the corners, suggesting it could have been attached to a stiffer support to allow tracing. So there's these kind of like really interesting objects where we're like, the histories are slightly unsure and we're still finding out about them. And there's also books by Donovan on natural history, sea life, and insects, alongside the natural history books, which I think today we often think of as artistic, but actually at the time they were scientific as well. So this was like obviously before photography, this was a way of understanding the world. And these illustrations are so amazing because they're so anatomically correct, a lot of them. So we were really learning about the world through drawing it because there was no other technology to do it. So alongside the kind of natural history and scientific books, there's also a collection of novels that belong to Ruskin, a collection of prose and often kind of first editions, or particularly beautiful editions of things like Pride and Prejudice. We've just displayed in the gallery with this kind of beautiful gilded peacock on the front. And this is another image from one of the Donovan natural history books of squids, which is a very popular image for us. It's kind of using it on a couple of exhibitions at the moment. So the collection is the actual kind of book collection is also supported by a large and growing supporting library of books and texts which are by, about, and on topics close to Ruskin's interest. So there's a research resource which contextualizes the historic books and other works of art that sit within the collection. So the collection is actually kind of two collections. We have the collection of books, which are historical and very important, and then we have like a whole academic library that contextualizes that collection and helps us learn about it. One of the difficulties of the collection is that most of the artworks are worked on paper, which is some of the most delicate and kind of difficult works for museums to look after because of their vulnerability to fading. So this means that often they can only be seen for short amounts of time before we have to put them back to sleep for many months. So the amount of damage is controlled and the works are actually kept accessible for future generations. So some of them are actually so delicate that we actually count the literal number of hours they're on display. We call it light hours, and they're only allowed to be seen in so many light hours every kind of 5 years. So this is why we're kind of working to make the gallery more changeable and get more things out. So alongside the books and prints, there is a large collection of minerals. So obviously Ruskin was a complete kind of typical Victorian polymath. He was interested in everything. So he was interested in animals, social justice, and the natural world. And geology was very popular at the time in understanding the elements. Ruskin was a member of the Geological Society, and he stated that, quote, "For a stone, when it is examined, will be found a mountain in miniature," end quote. So again, reiterating his belief in the close observation of nature and how when we look very, very closely, we can start to understand the whole world. We've just had some of these re-photographed actually, which look beautiful. So we're kind of thinking how we can share these lovely ones. So alongside the mineral collection, there's also a collection of numismatics, which is our museum word for coins and medals. So there's a collection of medals and coins that Ruskin collected, and it's also one of my all-time favorite words, numismatics. It's just very enjoyable to say, I think. Alongside these books, these minerals, these numismatics, there's also a collection of works of art that could be broadly described as architectural. So these include hundreds of drawings of entire buildings, as well as beautiful close-ups of architectural details. Ruskin was fascinated by the built environment on several levels. He believed that highly ornamented and decorated buildings provide a wealth of fulfilling work for artisans, allowing them to create their own fulfilling part of a building or small section, which demonstrates their skills, and therefore providing them with fulfilling work, which would then go on to become part of a larger whole. So these are my words, not Ruskin's, but I kind of see that as almost a socialist approach to architecture. He's kind of interested in everyone being able to have their own kind of input and find that fulfilling work by helping the greater good, which is really interesting. And actually, this architectural approach was used by Assembly, who were the 2015 Turner Prize winners for their work in Toxteth in Liverpool, where they worked for a number of different designers that like create tiny details in these beautiful houses for lower income families, which is another illustration of how ahead of his time much of Ruskin's thinking was. Ruskin's interest in architecture also considered its decay and the loss of these buildings. So Ruskin worried that some of the best examples of this skilled craftsmanship would be lost, quote, like a lump of sugar in hot tea due to poor upkeep. I think Venice, Ruskin was particularly interested in Venice, and he spent time in Venice. He kind of commissioned people to go draw Venice, but I think what we're seeing nowadays with Venice sinking and all of the damage caused by the cruise ships is again like the same thing. It's kind of Venice is slowly kind of sinking into this hot cup of tea. And again, he could see that happening even in the 19th century. He also believed that the buildings would be destroyed because of poor upkeep and industrialization and increasing pollution of cities. So he was always kind of also aware that pollution was damaging these buildings. As well as drawing details of architecture across Europe himself, he commissioned artists such as John Wharton Bunny to travel widely and record Europe's finest architecture. So in some instances, plaster casts were even produced from architectural details so that Venice could return to Sheffield in all its 3D glory. So this is a painting by Bunny of San Marco in Venice, which took 600 mornings, I think. It's incredibly beautiful, but we also have like all these details in the collection of this. And there's also these drawings of plaster casts, but actually like plaster casts taken from the building as well, which are in the collection. So in terms of what Mel's actually asked me to discuss, which is what is Ruskin's legacy, we need to think about what does this leave us with? So, you know, it leaves us with a lot of stuff. And here I'm being incredibly glib. You know, this is a huge number of incredibly beautiful works of art, which are important on an artistic, social, and a cultural level. But for me, what is most important, what Ruskin's strongest legacy is his ideas and how the founding of the collection constructs the freedom for its future use. So kind of what do I mean by this? I mean, by setting up a collection for the working people of Sheffield, by stating that he wanted it to encourage them to learn about art and nature, he wanted to encourage people to look carefully at the world around them and encourage them to take a country walk and take action from the things they've seen. He gifted us as curators a complete freedom of interpretation. These are not drawings of birds or of architecture or of bugs that are locked in time, but drawings of birds that Ruskin has already encouraged us to reevaluate, reuse, and to make relevant going forward. So that sounds like what all curators do or like what all legacies do, but it's kind of not the case. So I don't know if any of you know about the Isabella Gardner Museum in Chicago, Boston. I've probably Boston, maybe. Anyone correct me on that one? But again, this was a legacy that was given by a philanthropist. But she wrote into the legacy that you can't change anything. You can't move anything in that museum that she's given, to the point where there was actually a heist and 5 of the paintings were stolen and they have to display the empty frames. And there are also instances in New York, in the Met, where people have given kind of rooms from their kind of rich houses to the Met Museum, and they have to be displayed as if they were displayed in their house at home. So the idea of a legacy which gives you a freedom to reinterpret is actually quite interesting and quite exciting as curators. It's just not always the case. So the next question is, how do we do this? Well, this is where we move on to the refurb of the Ruskin Gallery, which I'm working on at the moment. So in this gallery, we wanted to use the collection in a way that brings Ruskin's ideas up to date, makes them relevant. To start to do this, we have summarized Ruskin's ideas into 4 broad themes to work with as curators. And these will be themes that we work on over the next 5 to 10 years in different exhibitions and projects, but these are kind of what's underpinning our thinking. So it's Ruskin's ideas in social justice and the role of working people, environmental conservation and the protection of historic buildings, rural economies and traditional crafts, and the importance of beauty, nature, and well-being. So how do these four ideas run through what we do? Then from this, we chose themes to work with on this specific exhibition that I'm working on. So for this show, we're combining environmental conservation and the importance of beauty, nature, and being outside for well-being. So to do this, I've looked at the collection for objects that would work with these messages. We chose to work with a collection of almost 7,000 ornithological illustrations, which are part of the collection, so the lovely bird drawings. To do this, I pulled out a variety to demonstrate the breadth of the collection, the different artists, the geographic regions, and the historic spread of the collection. And in quite a formalist approach, I just chose different looking birds. We didn't want them to all look the same. That's not an interesting exhibition for anyone. So the next thing for me to do was to think about how this would relate to our audience and to Ruskin's ideas themselves. So birds are one of the clearest signs of climate change. And when we discuss extinction, the dodo is often the first example that comes to mind. So birds are really clearly linked to this idea of conservation. So we can easily understand climate change through counting birds in our own back gardens, something that any one of us can do. And through this looking at nature for what it is, not an idealized version of nature, but actually looking and counting and paying attention, learning from observation, which is a Ruskinian idea that he based his drawing practice on, we can learn in a scientific manner about the world around us. So after choosing the works I was going to display, I did quite a lot of research in the gallery. And when you come to the gallery, you'll see that each bird's label is color coded with its endangered status. So these endangered statuses are taken from an amalgamation of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature's Red List and the Royal Society for Protection of Birds UK Conservation Status List. So this for us is a way of connecting these historic drawings to the present status of the species they're depicting and allowing us to learn relevant information from the birds within these historic drawings. The next layer of interpretation was to bring children in and to encourage children to look carefully. This was done in a pretty simple way. We worked off the idea of a simple A to Z of birds, which is often a child's first introduction to bird life through a simple book. So for this, we created an A to Z trail for children to follow through the gallery labels. So often we feel that these kind of historic drawings in general, historic works, could be removed from our everyday lives or described in strictly art historical terms. So to kind of disrupt this, I approached some volunteers who work with us at Aberdale Industrial Hamlet as gardeners to talk to me about some of the birds depicted in the exhibition, asking where you might see them in Sheffield, if they had memories of these birds, basically just like a really informal chat. And by using these conservations within the actual interpretation labels in the gallery, we're again linking these drawings back to every person's real life and their real life in Sheffield, as Ruskin intended. We're encouraging people to look when they get home and relate the drawings they've seen in the museum back to their real lives at home. The third strand of interpretation was to discuss why some of these species were endangered in the first place. So for this, we worked with a student from the University of Manchester to create an interpretive panel about how egrets became endangered because of their feathers being used in the fashion trade. Again, bringing this up to date at the end of the text, there's a short section on a Sheffield maker who creates slow recycled clothing today. So again, we want to kind of take the issues in these works that they start off with these kind of beautiful drawings of birds and ask us to think about them in a more contemporary way and ask why they were being drawn, why they're extinct. You know, how is this going to help us think about the outside world through learning from these historic drawings? And the fourth part of the display was to inspire wonder. So Ruskin wanted his audience to be inspired by the wonder and beauty of the collection he'd built. So today, with the rise of digital images, film, CGI, everyone's computers, art can sometimes need a little bit of a helping curatorial hand to magnify the wow factor and to help us look more closely. So to do this, we've worked with artist Paul Evans to display a collection of the birds nesting in their own tree, which draws them together as a flock, removing the history and geography and presenting them as kind of beautiful images. The mineral collection has also been redisplayed in a new mirrored infinity case, which heightens that jewel-like quality. So it's kind of difficult to get in this picture, but when you come into the space, when you get up close, those minerals just kind of go on forever into the distance because it's all mirrored back and forth. And then we've made some big changes to the space of the gallery. So taking the walls out, changing the colors, which gives us more hanging space and more opportunity to bring out more of the collection more easily. So here are some before and afters of the gallery. There's with the curved walls and with the new walls. This is the entrance space. So we've removed the curved walls and we've brought out all of this new interpretation where we're focusing on these ideas and how we take these ideas forward and kind of really putting to the front of the gallery why this collection is in Sheffield, why it's important, and how we're going to use it. And again, here's a view of the gallery as it was and the new bird display that we're doing. So all of these displays have been designed so they're more changeable as well. So on the left here, this image with the old bunny and the massive decal, that was very difficult to change, but now we've removed that sticker at the top. We can kind of change these drawings more often, basically. So when I think of Ruskin's legacy and what we hope the new refurbished gallery to communicate about his legacy, it's more than the objects on display. It's a set of ideas which are relevant today and the freedom for the collection to be reinterpreted by different voices and stay relevant and connected to these ideas as society shifts forward. This is the beauty of all the works donated to Sheffield Museums collections and all of the legacies that we receive. That through the work we do, they are kept alive and they are kept relevant for the future. Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you, Ash, for that. Has anyone got any questions that they would like to ask Ash? I can't see anything in the comments. If you'd like to type your questions in, I will read them out to Ash. So it's just in the chat button at the bottom. You can type any questions in. So Vicky's currently typing. So Vicky's first question, Ash, is why Sheffield? So I assume that's why did Ruskin pick Sheffield as the place to trial his ideas?
Yeah, cool. Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. He chose Sheffield because, well, the reason he came here was because his ex-student moved here, was from here, so he came to visit him a couple of times. He didn't actually visit Sheffield a huge number of times, but he was very interested in craft and the metalworking in Sheffield. So there's a mix between, he was looking for somewhere where he felt the audience would gain the most from his collection. And he felt because there was already a rich vein of craftsmanship and metal and steel working in the city, and it was surrounded by nature, that his collection could really do that here. So the people who were already skilled in aesthetics and skilled in making beautiful objects would come visit, and then they would be encouraged out into the countryside. So it was kind of a mix of geography, a mix of the kind of social aspects of the city and the people who lived in the city and what they were doing for a living. I'm not sure if he looked at other cities, but I know he was not interested in kind of the Industrial Revolution side of things being mass produced. And I think he saw less of that in Sheffield than he saw in places like Manchester and London. So he felt like it had a kind of slightly different hand. The skills were more hand-based.
Thanks, Ash. Another question is, when will the Ruskin Gallery reopen?
Opens on Saturday. So we're just doing the final cleaning tomorrow. It's going to reopen.
So yes, so you'll have to come and be one of the first few people to see the Ruskin Gallery, because I've not even had a chance to have a look at it yet. So yeah, it's exciting. Any more questions? Oh, another question is, I understand the fragile works cannot be displayed for very long, but can they not be photographed and the photographs be on show?
So part of the work we're doing is photographing things. So if you look on the website, there are photographs of the collection. At the moment, we're photographing some of the books, and we're going to be creating a kind of flick through where you can digitally flick through the pages of the books, which will be coming in a month or two. It's kind of an ongoing project. But in terms of displaying the photos, I think we want to stick with the original objects. Like, part of the reason for doing this work to the gallery is to make it far easier for us to display more of the objects. So the walls of kind of all those big stickers have been taken off, so we have more space, so we can do that. But the photographs and the collection are very slowly being made available digitally online. But I think when people they want to come see the originals. They want to see there's a texture and stuff to the originals.
What was Ruskin like as a person, and what was his relationships with other people like, both rich and poor?
I think that's a really hard one to answer, because you can only go from kind of his writings and his ideas. I think looking back on him from today, we would find him slightly eccentric. There are stories about his mother wanting to go to Oxford with him. He was quite sheltered. I think he was quite, in some way, removed from the working classes, but he had this notion that he wanted to help them. So yeah, I think he was a kind of typical English eccentric in a way. I know he had relationships with other people in the kind of higher echelons of British society, but there's not a huge amount about kind of what he was like. I think he was quite determined. But yeah, he was a kind of true obsessive academic. Like, he wrote an incredible amount and he collected an incredible amount. So I think he was one of those people who was like very, very interested in ideas and objects and things and wanted to share it. But it's a really hard one to answer.